So hi and welcome to this course entitled Trauma and Literature, where we're looking at Virginia Woolf's novel Mrs. Dalloway. We've already had a series of lectures on this novel, and we've seen how the biomedical climate in this particular novel is a very cruel climate, and how that does away with any sense of human agency, and how the medical practitioners in this novel, the way they're represented, is quite barbaric, and the way there's a very empathy-less gaze that they have with the human subject. And the human subject happens to be a post-traumatic stress disorder suffering veteran, a war veteran from the First World War, who comes back to London after the war. And as I mentioned in one of my previous lectures, who cannot seems to integrate back into the civilian space. So among other things, this novel is also about disintegration at a very medical, corporeal, cognitive level. And this mingling of corporeality and a cognitive quality in this novel makes it a very fertile and rich text to look at in terms of how the biomedical practice, how the biomedical climate appears to be extremely insufficient to treat the human subject suffering from a very deep cognitive crisis. And the other thing about Septimus Smith, obviously, is his crisis is not just medical, it's also emotional in quality. And existential in quality as well, because he seems to suffer from survivor's guilt, he seems to suffer from a whole host of other things, which we will see in this novel. But the way he is treated by the biomedical practitioners, the way he's treated by the doctors, is a very materialist kind of method. So it is a sort of very proportion-based. It is very, very physical, very corporeal, as I mentioned. And if there's nothing detected at a corporeal, physical level, the doctors seem to say that there's nothing wrong with him. So in other words, what we see here is a complete lack of understanding on the part of the doctors, a complete lack of empathy on the part of the doctors, who just treat the patient as some kind of an object, a medical object. And this distinction between object and subject is something which you will see running throughout Mrs. Dalloway. One of the central themes, one of the central threats in the novel is exactly this, how the human subject is commodified or reified into a medical object, and how this process of reification is a very cruel process, right? And this cruelty is something that we see happening over and over again. Now, what this does at a very sort of fundamental cognitive level is it plays out the difference between the materiality and the spectrality. That difference begins to blur away in some sense. The boundaries begin to blur away. So what is material and what is spectral is not quite clear. And as I mentioned, Septimus seems to suffer from a sense of survivor's guilt. He keeps having visions about the past, and there's a constant reference to a character who doesn't appear, Evans, as I mentioned, a spectral character who's never quite there as a physical presence, but is very much there as a spectral presence. Something like a haunting presence, a haunted presence. And this sort of haunted quality is something which we see characterizing the climate of London in general. The entire city seems to be immersed in this hauntological framework. By hauntological, I mean the haunted ontological framework, or the haunted existence. The war is gone, the war is finished, and there's a lot of references to the war as being over, but the spectral residual presence of war sort of lingers on in public imagination as well. Now, as we see that, there are, as I mentioned, there are these materialistic spectral thing happening all the time, and the boundaries between the material and the spectral are never quite clear. Not least, the novel gets focalized to Septimus's eye, Septimus's consciousness. In that consciousness, which is very shattered consciousness, very troubled consciousness, the boundaries are very, very unclear. And so what he sees as a material phenomenon in front of him, and what appears to him as a spectral phenomenon, are very, very sort of entangled together in a way which is very messy. And this messiness is something which the doctors hate about Septimus. And the hatred of the doctors against Septimus, the resentment that the doctors have for Septimus is exactly because the doctors look at Septimus as a clinical object which has to be quantified, which must be quantified, which must be given a number, which must be given a digit, which must be given a body. So anything outside the physical corporeal parameter is not recognized as a problem. So among other things, Mrs. Dalloway is also about the lack of recognition, the war veteran comes back. He's no longer a war hero, and not just that, he's not even recognized as a suffering subject. And its lack of recognition as a suffering subject is something which makes the entire novel very, very, cruel in quality. So it's about human cruelty, about or the institutional cruelty, or patriarchal cruelty, because we see a very clear collusion between patriarchy and medicine in this novel. The doctors are all males. They are very robust, physically strong males, very patriarchal in quality, and there seems to be a lot of references to the Boy Scout, the strong, sturdy masculinity. That is the preferred, the coveted model of masculinity, which the doctors seem to prescribe for Septimus. So they keep telling him, go play cricket, don't introspect too much, don't think so much, because thinking or introspecting, over-introspecting, as they would say, is a very unmanly thing. So man up, in other words. So we have a very interesting mingling of masculinity and medicine over here, as I mentioned. Now, this section, which should be on your screen at the moment, is, we did talk about it in a bit earlier as well, where we have the skywriting aeroplane coming in and how different people are looking at it from different perspectives. And a skywriting aeroplane in a post-war London can mean many things, because the fear of the bombing aeroplane is never quite gone. It's still there, some kind of a presence. But then this is a different kind of aeroplane. This aeroplane is not a bombing aeroplane. It's an advertising aeroplane. It's advertising for toffee of all things. So it's a commodity, and it's advertising another commodity, which is meant to be consumed. But this is the interesting thing in the novel, that the consumerist quality in the novel, where people are looking out to consume the science, is never quite far from the fear factor that this is a plane which reminds people of violent aeroplanes which were there before. And obviously with Septimus, this has a different cognitive register altogether, because when it's looking at the aeroplane, it's thinking of the war all the time. So this particular section where Lucrezia, Septimus's wife, who's Italian and who's also an outsider for a different reason, as a female, as an Italian, and she's a complete outsider linguistically as well. And she's trying to make Septimus feel better, so she's taking him for a walk. So as we can see how Septimus is very symbolically, quote-unquote, emasculated, because he can't take care of himself. He wants someone else to help him all the time. So he has to be cared for all the time. Now, in this section where Lucrezia takes Septimus for a walk and she's pointing out the aeroplane to him and asking him to take notice of that, because she has been told by the doctors that Septimus should look outside of himself. And this is on your screen. Look, look, Septimus, she cried, for Dr. Holmes had told her to make her husband, who had nothing whatsoever seriously the matter with him, but was a little out of sorts, take an interest in things outside himself. So this section is important because the doctors have decided that the husband is absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with him, seriously. Nothing whatever seriously the matter with him, and that has been determined and decided by the doctor. So again, we are looking at this complete lack of empathy, a lack of understanding, lack of recognition for the suffering subject, because in the very quantitative materialist medical gaze, there seems to be nothing wrong with Septimus. So the doctors have decided he's absolutely fine. That's a diagnosis at any rate. And his diagnosis is obviously very commodifying. It's very, very quantitative, and it's sort of calibrating him in some sense, and not recognizing him as a suffering subject. And they have also advocated that he takes an interest outside of himself. So introspection seems to be a pathological condition. The thinking man is a problem for these doctors, because that doesn't fit into, that doesn't conform to the model of masculinity that they are always advocating. And if you look at the bodies of the doctors in a novel, they are like big, sturdy, heavy men, very successful, very precise, very sure, very certain about what they want. And this absolute certainty of medical gaze is something which obviously fails to engage with the existential uncertainty that Septimus suffers from. So we have, on the one hand, we have this very commodifying gaze of the doctors, and on the other hand, we have this very messy, subjective situation of the human sufferer, and they are completely incompatible. So among other things, it's a story about incompatibility. So the diagnosing gaze, the medical gaze, and the suffering subject are completely incompatible with each other. And so doctors are telling the wife that there's nothing wrong with your husband. They just ask him to take an interest outside of himself. He's just over-introspecting, and that is a problem. So in this section, Lucrezia is trying very hard to make Septimus take notice of the aeroplane in the sky. So, thought Septimus, and I'm quoting again, so thought Septimus, looking up, they are signaling to me, not indeed in actual words. That is, he could not read the language yet, but it was plain enough, this beauty, this exquisite beauty, and tears filled his eyes as he looked at the smoke words languishing and melting in the sky, and bestowing upon him in their inexhaustible charity and laughing goodness, one shape after another, of unimaginable beauty, and signaling their intention to provide him for nothing, forever, for looking merely, with beauty, more beauty. Tears ran down his cheeks. So we have a weeping man, a soldier coming back from the war who's supposed to be heroic, supposed to be masculine, supposed to be unemotional. He was trained in not being emotional, and now it's just the other way around. Tears are running down his cheeks, and he can't control it. It's a compulsive condition, right? And this weeping man, someone who's weeping in joy, someone who can't control his emotions, becomes the problem. He's a messy man, and this mess that Septimus embodies is a problem for the doctors, and not just for the doctors, but also for the civilians around him, because it doesn't fit into the hegemonic model of masculinity, the strong, stoic, sturdy masculinity anymore. So we see a complete shift from one end of the spectrum to the other end of the spectrum over here. The stoic subject, the unemotional subject, the masculine subject, the heroic subject, is suddenly become a weeping person, and he's not weeping because he is grieving for anything. He's weeping because he can't control his emotions. He's weeping out of joy. This is a weep. This is a tears out of joy. So he's looking at a signaling aeroplane in the sky, and it looks like a spiritual thing for him. It looks like it's some kind of epiphanic moment where the airplane is writing something in the sky. He can't quite understand the language, but he sees the beauty of the entire spectacle, and that spectacular beauty is moving him. So we find that there is a degree of hypersensitivity in Septimus, and that's because he is completely traumatized. He's a suffering subject. He can't control his emotions, and this is getting aggravated because the medical science at that point in time is not recognizing him as a sufferer, is not recognizing him as someone with a problem. They just determine he's got no problem at all. And this lack of recognition, as I mentioned, is something which is obviously aggravating his condition. And as I did mention in one of my previous lectures on this novel, that symptom of PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, it took years for military medicine to classify it as a disease. It was like after the Vietnam War, when this was classified as a disease, as a classified disease, as a nosological category. But at this point in time in First World War, it was called all kinds of names. Shell shock was the most popular name given to it. Now, obviously, the term shell shock, as I mentioned in one of my previous sessions, has got nothing to do with shells. There's no physical problem with Septimus. So his problem is emotional. He's emotionally traumatized. He's suffering from shock. He's suffering from a cognitive dissonance. But the medical science at this point in time, it doesn't have the vocabulary to address or engage with it. It doesn't have the rhetoric, doesn't have the instrument, doesn't have the perspective to understand it. So it is still sticking onto a very materialist medical gaze, which is completely incompatible and insufficient in terms of engaging with the suffering subject. And as I did mention, if you look at the from a medical historical perspective, this was a time in Britain where Sigmund Freud became important, where psychoanalysis became important, right? And the whole idea of the talk cure, the whole idea of the asking the subject to speak, asking the subject to talk about the dreams, those become very, very important categories of diagnosis post Sigmund Freud. But obviously Holmes and Bradshaw, who are the doctors in this novel, are a pre-Freudian, they belong to a pre-Freudian medical vocabulary, right? As a result of which, they seem to have no understanding at all of this kind of trauma, and because they can't diagnose anything at an empirical, corporeal level. So to decide and dictate, nothing was wrong with Septimus, and that is something which we see, this constant incompatibility. So tears are running down his cheeks. It was toffee. They were advertising toffee. A nursemaid told Rezia together they began to spell T-O-F. So we can see how the letters are coming together and the sign system is happening in the sky, and how everything seems very slowed down and decelerated to Septimus. And this sort of cognitive deceleration and this cognitive defamiliarization is something which you see all the time in this novel. He's completely defamiliarized. London to him appears a very defamiliarized space. There seems to be a very dramatic and cognitive defamiliarization as a result of which he can't engage at all with the London that he once knew. And this becomes, at a very core fundamental level, a problem of embodiment. And by embodiment, I mean the neural, cognitive, and as well as the extended and active engagement with the environment. Embodiment has a very embedded quality. It is about the neurons, it's about you process information in your brain, through your body, through your nerves, through the neural system. But equally, it's also an active process, an extended process in terms of how the subject extends itself to its environment, apropos of its environment. So it has a loop-like quality, the inside and the outside, the embedded and extended. They all come together in this process of embodiment, embodiment being a process, a cognitive process, an interactive process. So among other things, Septimus seems to suffer from a crisis in embodiment because on the one hand, he's medically ill, he's neurally ill, he can't cognize reality, he can't cognize the surroundings the way he used to, and that has been aggravated by the cultural condition, which doesn't recognize them as a suffering subject, which doesn't recognize him as a sufferer at all, and they are very dismissive of his condition. And this medical dismissal, this medical lack of empathy is something which obviously aggravates his inactive engagement with the environment. So it is a very complex cognitive process, but it becomes a crisis in embodiment at some level. So they begin to spell together for Septimus, the whole idea, the toffee that is being advertised in the sky. KR, so the nursemaid, and Septimus heard her say KR. So again, it's like decelerated, close to his ear, deeply, softly, like a mellow organ, but with a roughness in a voice like a grasshopper's, would rasp his spine deliciously and sent running up to his brain waves of sound, which, concussing, broke. So you can see the very slowed down cognitive neural process. It enters his brain, it wraps his spine deliciously, and it just sends waves across the brain, and then there's a rupture in his brain. So the normal cognitive process is decelerated and defamiliarized and interrupted in some sense. And this interrupted subject becomes a very important symbolic presence in Mrs. Dalloway. Septimus is an interrupted subject because his engagement with reality, his engagement with embodiment is interrupted through trauma, through shock, through loss, through violence, and obviously is not being helped by the dismissal that is receiving, the resentment that is receiving from the doctors around him. Okay, a marvelous discovery indeed that a human voice in certain atmospheric conditions, one must be scientific, above all scientific. So we can see the parody in Woolf's novel is taking a jibe at the hyper-scientific quality of medicine. One must be scientific, one must above all be scientific. So the human voice in certain atmospheric conditions can quicken trees into life. So the human voice, the way you process it, can sometimes quicken your cognitive process, and sometimes it can decelerate it as well. Happily, Rezia put a hand with a tremendous weight on his knee, so that he was weighed down, transfixed, all the excitement of the elm trees rising and falling, with all the leaves alight and the color thinning and thickening from blue to the green of the hollow wave, like plumes on horses' heads, feathers on ladies, so proudly they rose and fell. So superbly would have sent him mad, but he would not go mad. He would shut his eyes, he would see no more. So this shutting of eyes becomes a very symbolic cognitive strategy, a very symbolic cognitive maneuver on the part of Septimus, because he can't take it anymore, he can't process reality anymore, he can't cognize anymore. It's becoming too much for him. So this is what I meant when I said that this is a example of an interrupted subject who cannot function corporally, who cannot function cognitively, who cannot take in, who cannot absorb reality, who cannot cognize reality. So it's shutting down the system in some sense, because the system is about to break. It's a spillover. He can't take it anymore. There's an excess of information, and he can't process it sequentially like he used to. And his lack of processing, the crisis of processing, is what making him mad in some sense. But the beckoned, the trees were alive, the leaves were alive, and the leaves being connected by millions of fibers with his own body. There on the seat, fanned it up and down. When the branch stretched, he too made that statement. Now, this is a very interesting point, and I may have read the section before in passing, but I'm just going to introduce a term today in this lecture along with spectrality and materiality, and that is the idea of meta-plasticity. Now, what do I mean by meta-plasticity? Meta-plasticity is that condition, is that theory which doesn't put the human at the center of the environment. Rather, it looks at the human and the non-human, the organic and the inorganic, as sort of connected categories all the time. All of them are metaplastic in equal way. They're all part of a metaplastic system. So metaplasticity is where the human and the leaves, the fibers and the nerves and the leaves, they become one. They become connected without any presupposition of privilege, without any presupposition of a central privilege, right? So the human is not the centralized, the human is not the located subject who is looking at the environment. Rather, the human is one among the many components of this plastic environment. And this metaplasticity is what makes the entire environment in a very connected ecosystem. Now, what this does, obviously, is that it completely undercuts the humanistic notion of man being the center of the entire ecosystem. It undercuts, it sort of deconstructs and deflates the idea of the human subject as the supreme subject, as a centralized subject. Rather, the human becomes one of the many components in this ecosystem. The nerves, the fibers, the leaves, the trees, the human brain, they all become connected in an entangled network of different kinds of cognitive categories. Now, this metaplasticity is exactly what is happening over here. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this term, this complex theoretical term, which is used in embodiment studies today, is because it completely undercuts the medical notion over here, because the medical notion, as you can see, represented by Holmes and Bradshaw, it still places the human being, the man, the white man, of course, is heavily racialized, the white man being the sturdy center of the entire cognitive system. So the man has to be the center. The man will receive information, and the man will process information, whereas the metaplastic you can also extend it into post-humanist understanding of the ecosystem. It doesn't place a man at the center of the universe at all. So it just becomes a man, the human mind just becomes one of the many systems interacting with each other in a distributive network, in a fluid network, right? So instead of a centralized network, it's a fluid network. And Septimus is sort of moving into this fluid form of cognition, where we can see that everything is connected to everything else. The leaves being connected by millions of fibers with its own body. There on the seed, fanned it open down. When the branch stretched, he too made that statement. So the branch is stretching, he is stretching, the leaves are connected to his fibers, so everything is part of one metaplastic system, and it just becomes an inactive model of cognition rather than an embedded model of cognition, right? So it all becomes part of a process of cognition, where the leaves and the fibers connect to each other, dialoguing with each other. The sparrows fluttering, rising, and falling in jagged fountains were part of the pattern. The white and blue, bud with black branches, sounds made harmonies with premeditation. The spaces between them were as significant as the sound. So this is a very important section. He's hearing all kinds of sounds. Now, what is also important is the space between the sounds. That becomes as important as the sounds. Now, a child cried, rightly far away, a horn sounded, all taken together meant the birth of a new religion. Now, this is interesting because if we use modern neuroscience, which talks about synaptic plasticity, and I'm just bringing in this medical terms just so we can have a renewed understanding of this particular novel, which is a phenomenal novel written from a position of suffering and also the medical gaze on a suffering subject. But if you take a look at modern cognition studies, which tells us that cognition takes place between neurons, one neuron and other neuron, they sort of have this gap between them, and that is called a synapse. So our entire understanding of cognition is a synaptic process. It's sort of a process through the gaps, between the gaps. Now, when Woolf is writing, or the narrator is informing over here, that in Septimus's mind, the sound between the two sounds, or the blank space between the two sounds, become as significant as the sounds. It seems to be a very interiorized look at the human cognitive system as it really is. So what I'm saying is an interrupted subject, Septimus, when he's actually become an interrupted subject. What I'm saying is, and if you take a look at Septimus's mind, it's a slowed down version of the normative process of cognition, which gives us a better glimpse, which gives us a more graphic glimpse of how the human cognition really takes place, where we process information, where we're part of the system that we're processing. We are also part of it in a very cognitive way, where the distinction between the cognizing subject and a cognized object. It's completely blurred, where the subject and object become together as one ecosystem of metaplasticity. And this becomes a very different kind of cognitive system from the normal way, because in a normal parlance, a normal cognitive system, which is uninterrupted, there is this illusion of seamlessness, or the human being is just processing information. But with Septimus, because he's suffering from a crisis of embodiment, that seamlessness is interrupted in some sense, as a result of which he becomes, his mind becomes an excellent case study through which we can understand how cognition really works. And so a child cried, rightly far away, a horn sounded, all taken together meant the birth of a new religion. So I'll stop at this point now, but what this is a very brief session, and I'll carry on for the next session as well. But what I want you to take cognizance of are these terms, metaplasticity and synaptic plasticity. And when I'm saying Septimus is an interrupted subject, what I'm actually saying is the deceleration of his mind, the interruption in his mind, gives us a more graphic glimpse, as I mentioned. It gives us a sort of a renewed understanding, a privileged perspective into how the human mind really works. Because when we are processing information seamlessly or uninterruptedly, we don't recognize how cognition works. But this becomes almost a metacognitive system where we understand how we understand in some sense. So among other things, this is a very interesting novel from the perspective of trauma studies, but also from cognition studies, where we understand how cognition works. And a metacognitive quality in Septimus's mind is what makes it such a rich text that we'll continue to study in the subsequent lectures. Thank you for your attention.